Dead silence fell at 30,000 feet. Every radio gone. Both pilots unconscious. The plane flying itself with 174 people and no one in control. The adults froze. The engineers panicked. The doctors prayed. Then a 12-year-old walked into the cockpit and took the pilot's seat. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The dead silence came without any warning at exactly 30,000 feet. One moment, Flight 2291 from Chicago to Denver was just another routine afternoon service. The engines hummed steadily. Passengers read their books, watched movies on small screens, and sipped coffee from paper cups. Children dozed against window glass. Business travelers typed on laptops with practiced fingers. Everything was completely ordinary. And then, in the span of 3 seconds, all of that changed. Every radio in the cockpit went dead. Every communication screen turned black. The intercom system that connected the pilots to the cabin behind them fell completely silent. The transponder that told air traffic control exactly where the plane was stopped sending its signal. Not a single sound came from any instrument designed to connect the aircraft to the outside world. It was as if someone had reached down from the sky and cut every wire at once. The cockpit, which had been filled with the constant chatter of air traffic radio and the soft beeping of systems, became as quiet as an empty room at midnight. Captain Howard Briggs noticed it first. He tapped his headset twice, the way experienced pilots do when they think the volume might be turned down. Nothing. He switched to the backup radio frequency. Nothing there either. He tried the emergency channel. The same dead silence greeted him. Beside him, First Officer Angela Reyes was already reaching for the intercom phone to call the cabin crew. She pressed the button and held the receiver to her ear. Silence. Not static. Not a broken signal. Just pure, total silence, as if the phone had never been connected to anything at all. All communications are down, Reyes said, keeping her voice even the way pilots are trained to do. Radio, transponder, intercom. Everything. That is not possible, Briggs replied, but his hands were already moving across the instrument panel, checking systems. The electrical gauges showed normal. The generators were running. The batteries were fully charged. Every system that should be working was showing green lights. And yet nothing that involved sending or receiving a signal was functioning at all. What neither pilot could see, and what the aircraft's sensors were only beginning to detect, was the problem unfolding silently beneath the cockpit floor. A small seal in the aircraft's ventilation system had developed a microscopic crack 3 hours earlier, during the previous flight. The crack had widened slowly, gradually, invisibly. Now it was allowing a faint trace of carbon monoxide to seep into the cockpit air supply. The amount was small. It was not enough to trigger any alarm immediately. But in an enclosed space at high altitude, where the air is already thinner, even a small amount of carbon monoxide works quickly on the human brain. It was working now. Captain Briggs felt it first as a mild headache, the kind pilots sometimes get at altitude. He ignored it. Then came a faint dizziness, the feeling that his thoughts were moving just slightly slower than they should. He blinked hard and focused on the instruments. First Officer Reyes pressed her fingers to her temple and frowned. The cockpit suddenly felt warmer than it should. She reached for the temperature controls, but her hand felt strangely heavy. In the cabin, 12-year-old Jake Mercer sat in seat 22A, his face turned toward the window. From the outside, he looked exactly like what he appeared to be. A quiet, thin boy with dark hair and serious eyes, traveling alone from Chicago to Denver, wearing a gray hoodie and carrying a worn backpack with a small patch of the American flag on the front. The flight attendant had brought him an extra bag of pretzels when she saw he was unaccompanied. The older woman seated next to him, a retired teacher named Mrs. Calloway, had asked him if he was going to visit family. "My dad," Jake had said simply. "He lives in Denver now." Mrs. Calloway had nodded and returned to her crossword puzzle. Jake had turned back to the window. But he was not watching the clouds. He was studying the horizon line, the way it curved almost imperceptibly at the edges. He was calculating in his head how long they had been flying, what their approximate position was, and what the weather system moving in from the west might do to their approach into Denver. He had been doing things like this his whole life, and he barely noticed he was doing it anymore. Jake's father, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Mercer, had spent 22 years flying for the United States Air Force. He had flown F-16 Fighting Falcons over 3 countries. He had completed more than 400 flight hours in combat conditions. He had trained junior pilots for 6 years and was considered by his commanding officers to be one of the finest aviators they had ever produced. Then, on a perfectly clear Tuesday morning 18 months ago, during a routine training exercise, a mechanical failure had caused his aircraft to lose control at low altitude. He had ejected successfully. His spine had not survived the ejection cleanly. Colonel Mercer was alive. He could sit upright in a wheelchair. He could hold a coffee cup and read a book and laugh at his own jokes, which he still did regularly. What he could no longer do was walk, or fly, or be the Air Force pilot he had been his entire adult life. He had retired on medical grounds and moved to a small house outside Denver, not far from the mountains he had once flown over. During the 18 months between his accident and this particular afternoon flight, Marcus Mercer had done one thing with more dedication than anything else in his life. He had taught his son everything he knew about aviation. It had started simply, the way most obsessions do. Jake would visit during school breaks, and his father would tell him stories about flying. The stories became explanations. The explanations became lessons. His father had always been a teacher at heart, and teaching Jake became the thing that got him out of bed every morning. He purchased professional flight simulator software, the same programs used by commercial aviation training centers. He ordered technical manuals. He borrowed a full-size cockpit instrument panel from a retired aviation enthusiast he knew and set it up in the living room of his Denver house, and Jake had spent entire visits sitting in front of it while his father, in his wheelchair beside him, talked him through every instrument, every system, every emergency procedure. Jake's mother had expressed concern exactly once. She had called Marcus on a Sunday evening and said, quietly but firmly, that she did not think it was healthy to fill a 12-year-old boy's head with aviation emergencies and worst-case scenarios. Marcus had listened carefully. Then he had said, "Angela, I was the best pilot in my unit. I flew perfectly. And a 2-cent mechanical seal still almost killed me. The world does not ask you if you are ready before something goes wrong. I would rather Jake know, and never need it, than need it and not know." Angela had not brought it up again. Jake had learned everything. He had learned how to read a primary flight display and a navigation display. He had learned what LNAV and VNAV meant, and what to do when they failed. He had learned the difference between an ILS approach and a visual approach. He had learned how to navigate by dead reckoning, using only time, heading, and airspeed to determine position. He had learned how to calculate fuel burn rates in his head. He had learned the emergency procedures for engine failure, hydraulic failure, electrical failure, and total communication loss. His father had drilled him on all of it, over and over, until Jake could recite the steps without thinking, until his hands knew where to go on the simulator panel before his brain had finished deciding to send them there. "You probably will never need any of this," his father had told him, just before Jake had boarded his flight in Chicago that morning. Marcus had driven himself to the airport in his hand-controlled vehicle and walked Jake to the security line in his wheelchair. But being prepared is never wasted. You understand that? "I know, Dad," Jake had said. His father had looked at him for a long moment. "I am proud of you. Whatever happens, I am always proud of you." Jake had thought, at the time, that it was just the kind of thing fathers say at airports. He was not thinking about that conversation when he noticed the flight attendants moving differently. It was subtle. Jake had always noticed things that other people did not. His father said it was a natural pilot's instinct, the ability to read an environment and detect when something was slightly off. The flight attendants, 3 of them, were clustered near the front of the cabin, speaking in voices too low for passengers to hear. One of them, a young woman with red hair, was holding the intercom phone and frowning at it as if it had said something rude. She pressed the button again. Waited. Pressed it again. The cabin lights flickered. Just once, very briefly. Most passengers did not look up. Jake looked up immediately. He watched the red-haired attendant pick up the phone again. He watched her expression shift from concern to something closer to alarm. He watched her walk quickly to the senior flight attendant, a tall man named Gerald whose name Jake had read on his name badge when he first boarded. Gerald listened, then immediately tried the phone himself. His face went still in the way that faces go still when someone is trying very hard not to show fear. Jake understood then. The intercom was down. Which meant the pilots either would not or could not respond. He thought about the flickering lights. An electrical event. He thought about the fact that the plane had been flying in a perfectly straight, perfectly level path for the last several minutes without a single adjustment. That was the detail that bothered him most. Real pilots made constant small corrections. A plane that was flying too perfectly straight, for too long, was a plane with no one actively flying it. The autopilot was on. And the pilots were not responding. Gerald walked back through the cabin with his face arranged into a careful expression of calm, and Jake watched him stop at the row ahead, lean down, and speak quietly to a heavy-set man in a business suit. The man shook his head. Gerald moved to the next row. A woman shook her head. Jake was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Sweetie, where are you going?" Mrs. Calloway asked, looking up from her crossword. Jake was already standing. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the aisle. Gerald had reached the middle of the cabin now and, accepting that quiet individual questioning was not working, had raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. We are experiencing some technical difficulties in the cockpit. I need to ask whether anyone on board has experience flying commercial aircraft." He paused. Any experience at all would be helpful. The cabin shifted. People looked at each other. A few passengers began to understand that this was not a routine announcement, and the ripple of fear that started in that moment spread quickly and quietly from row to row like a wave moving through water. A baby somewhere in the back began to cry. A man near the window said something in a low voice that sounded like a prayer. Nobody raised their hand. Jake walked up the aisle toward Gerald. "Excuse me," he said. Gerald looked down at him. "Son, please return to your seat." "I need to speak with you," Jake said. His voice was completely steady. It was the voice his father had trained into him during hundreds of simulation sessions, the calm, focused voice that a pilot uses when everything is going wrong. "I know what is happening. And I think I can help." Gerald studied the boy in front of him. 12 years old. Gray hoodie. Backpack with an American flag patch. He looked like a child who had gotten up to use the bathroom at the wrong moment. "Jake," Gerald said, reading the name off the unaccompanied minor form he was holding, "I understand you're scared. But I need you to go back and sit down." "I am not scared," Jake said. "I mean, I am, but that is not why I am standing here. My father is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Mercer. He was an Air Force pilot for 22 years. He taught me emergency flight procedures. I have been training on commercial aircraft simulators for over a year. I know how to read the instruments on a Boeing 737. I know the emergency procedures for communication failure and pilot incapacitation. Please let me help." Gerald stared at him. Mrs. Calloway had turned around in her seat. "He did seem very calm when we were talking," she offered, as if this were evidence of something. A man in the 4th row stood up. He was tall, with gray at his temples, and he had the straight posture of someone who had spent time in the military. I flew Cessnas, small planes, 12 years ago, he said. I have some understanding of basic instruments. But I have never touched anything this size. He looked at Jake. How much do you actually know, son? Jake answered without hesitation. At our current altitude of 30,000 feet, the autopilot is maintaining our heading and altitude. We are burning approximately 2,400 kilograms of fuel per hour. We departed Chicago 90 minutes ago, which puts us somewhere over central Nebraska, likely near the city of North Platte. Denver is approximately 370 nautical miles ahead. We have enough fuel to reach Denver and likely one alternate airport. The problem is we have no radio, no transponder, and no intercom. If the pilots are incapacitated, we are flying a fully automated aircraft with no one conscious who can land it. We need to descend while we still have options, identify our position visually, navigate to the nearest suitable airport, and land. I know the procedure for all of that. Silence. Absolute silence, the kind that falls over a group of people when something has shifted from impossible to real. Gerald made a decision. Come with me, he said. The cockpit door was already unlocked because Gerald had opened it 3 minutes earlier to check on the pilots. What he had found had sent him immediately back to the cabin. Now he pushed it open again and stepped aside to let Jake through. Jake Mercer walked into the cockpit of Flight 2291, and for a single second he stopped completely still. Captain Briggs was slumped in the left seat, his head fallen back, his hands loose in his lap. His chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths. He was alive, but completely unconscious. First Officer Reyes had collapsed sideways, her head resting against the side window, her headset hanging from one ear. The autopilot panel showed all green. The aircraft was flying itself, steady and level, at 30,000 feet over Nebraska, while the two people who were supposed to be guiding it sat motionless in their seats. Jake breathed in once, deeply. Then he moved. He needed the pilot's seat. The captain's seat. The left seat. That was where the primary controls were most accessible, where his father had always told him the commander sits when everything depends on one person making the right calls. Gerald was still standing in the cockpit doorway. I need you to help me move Captain Briggs, Jake said. Into the jump seat behind. I need to take the pilot's seat. Gerald stared at him for 1 second. Then he stepped forward without another word. Together, carefully and slowly, they lifted the unconscious captain and moved him to the cockpit jump seat, securing him with the harness there so he would not fall. Jake then moved to the left seat. The captain's seat. He pulled it forward until his feet reached the rudder pedals. He adjusted the height. He settled his hands on the control column and looked out through the windshield at 30,000 feet of open sky. His hands moved to the instrument panel with the quiet confidence of someone who had sat in front of nearly identical displays hundreds of times before. Gerald, Jake said, without looking away from the instruments, I need you to get me Captain Briggs's and First Officer Reyes's oxygen masks. There may be carbon monoxide in here. If there is, we need to address that first. Gerald moved immediately. Jake's eyes traveled across the primary flight display, the navigation display, the flight control unit, and the engine instruments. Everything he saw confirmed what he had calculated in his head in the cabin. What is the carbon monoxide reading? The Cessna pilot, who had followed them to the cockpit doorway, asked. The sensor just above the instrument panel is showing a trace reading, Jake said. Not enough to trigger the alarm system, but enough at altitude. That is likely what got the pilots. The ventilation system must have a breach somewhere. He reached above his head and opened the fresh air vent to maximum flow. Then he reached down and switched the cockpit air supply to the emergency external air intake, bypassing whatever contaminated line had affected the pilots. His father had walked him through this exact procedure during a simulation session 8 months ago, after reading about a carbon monoxide incident in an aviation safety report. Jake had complained at the time that it seemed unlikely to matter. His father had made him practice it 3 times anyway. Gerald placed the oxygen masks over the pilots' faces. Almost immediately, within a couple of minutes, Briggs's breathing became slightly deeper. He did not wake up, but the color of his face improved. "They need paramedics," Jake said. "We need to land." "Can you do it?" the Cessna pilot asked. His name, he told Jake, was Frank Hollis. His voice was careful, neither dismissive nor falsely encouraging. He was assessing, the way someone does when they genuinely need to know the answer. "I have done it hundreds of times in simulators," Jake said. "This is heavier and the controls have more resistance than the simulator. And we have no radio and no transponder, which means air traffic control does not know where we are. We are going to have to navigate visually, identify an airport, and land without any ground guidance." He paused. "But yes. I believe I can do it." "What do you need from me?" Frank Hollis asked. "Sit in the first officer's seat, there on the right," Jake said, gesturing to where Reyes had been sitting. Reyes had been carefully moved to a sitting position against the cockpit wall, her oxygen mask in place. "Read me the altitude and airspeed numbers when I ask. And do not touch anything unless I specifically tell you to." Frank nodded and sat down. Gerald stepped out to inform the passengers. Jake placed his hands on the control column and felt its weight. It was heavier than the simulator. The aircraft had a mass and solidity to it that no simulation could fully capture. He could feel the subtle vibrations of the engines through the yoke, feel the slight pressures the autopilot was making to hold the plane level. He took one more steady breath. "Disconnecting autopilot," he said aloud, the way his father had taught him. "In the cockpit, you always said what you were doing. Narrate every action. It keeps your mind clear and creates a record in the memory." He pressed the autopilot disconnect button. A soft double tone chimed. The aircraft was now under manual control. Under his control. The yoke shifted immediately in his hands. The plane wanted to drift slightly to the right. Jake applied a small left correction without thinking, leveling the wings. The aircraft responded. He made another small adjustment to the trim wheel to reduce the pressure required to hold the yoke steady. The plane settled. "You are flying it," Frank Hollis said, very quietly. "I am flying it," Jake confirmed. "Now we need to figure out exactly where we are." Without GPS, without radio, and without the flight management system's navigation display working correctly, Jake had to use dead reckoning. He knew their departure time, their cruise speed, their heading, and their approximate elapsed flight time. He worked the calculation in his head the way his father had taught him, cross-checking his estimate against the ground features he could see below. At 30,000 feet, the view was limited, but he could make out the broad shape of the landscape. "We need to descend," Jake said. "I cannot identify specific landmarks at this altitude. I am going to bring us down to 12,000 feet. That should put us below most of the terrain in this part of Nebraska while keeping us clear of the Rocky Mountain foothills to the west." "How will you know which way is west?" Frank asked. "The sun," Jake said simply. "It is mid-afternoon. The sun is moving toward the southwest. I can use that to confirm heading until I find ground references I recognize." He reached for the throttle levers. "I am reducing power and initiating a descent. Descent rate 1,500 feet per minute. I want to level off at 12,000 feet." He eased the throttles back and pushed the yoke gently forward. The nose of the aircraft dipped, and the altimeter began to unwind. In the cabin behind him, passengers felt the change in pitch and the change in pressure. Some gripped their armrests. A few closed their eyes. Mrs. Calloway pressed her hand flat on the tray table and looked out the window at the earth slowly growing larger below. Jake flew the descent with both hands on the yoke and both eyes moving constantly between the artificial horizon, the altimeter, and the view through the windshield. At 20,000 feet the cloud layer thinned and patches of ground became visible. At 15,000 feet he could see the broad flat geometry of the Nebraska plains clearly. Rivers showed as silver lines. Towns appeared as gray-brown clusters. Roads ran in long straight lines across the land. "I need a city," Jake said. "Something large enough to match against the chart." "Frank, in the side map case beside you there should be a paper approach chart booklet. Can you reach it?" Frank found it and handed it forward. Jake took it with his right hand, holding the yoke with his left, and opened it to the Nebraska section. He looked at the ground, then at the chart, then at the ground again. The river below was wide and moved from northwest to southeast. He could see a city on its eastern bank, a medium-sized town with a grid of streets and what looked like a small airport to its north. "That is the Platte River," Jake said, certainty clear in his voice. "And that city is North Platte. Which means we are exactly where I calculated. Denver is approximately 360 nautical miles to the southwest." He was quiet for a moment, running the numbers. "At our current speed and with our remaining fuel, we can reach Denver International. But Denver International is a very large and busy airport. Without a transponder, they will have no idea we are coming. We would be entering one of the most complex airspace corridors in the country completely unannounced." "What is the alternative?" Frank asked. "Colorado Springs," Jake said. "It is south of Denver by about 70 miles. It is a smaller airport, less traffic. More importantly, it is next to Peterson Air Force Base. Military radar is more sensitive and more actively monitored than commercial radar. There is a chance they have already detected an anomaly. An aircraft moving at commercial speed with no transponder signal will stand out to military tracking systems. If they have scrambled anything to investigate, they will see us." Frank stared at the boy. "You are 12 years old," he said, not unkindly. It was not a question. It was simply the only thought his mind could form. "Yes," Jake said. "Altitude check." 12,200 feet, Frank said automatically, looking at the altimeter. "Airspeed 290 knots. "I am leveling off," Jake said, pulling the yoke back gently and adding a small amount of power to arrest the descent. The aircraft settled at 12,000 feet. Jake adjusted the trim and set a new heading, angling to the southwest toward Colorado. In the cabin, Gerald was moving quietly through the rows, kneeling beside passengers, keeping his voice low. He told them the truth, because he judged that false reassurance would be worse than the reality. He told them that a young man was flying the aircraft, that he had training, that they were descending toward Colorado, and that they should remain in their seats with their seatbelts fastened. The reactions varied. Some people wept silently. Some gripped the hands of the strangers next to them. A few, in the way that human beings sometimes find unexpected stillness in the presence of extreme danger, became very calm. Mrs. Calloway closed her crossword puzzle book and held it in her lap and looked out the window at the world below. Inside the cockpit, Jake kept flying. He followed Interstate 76, southwest the way his father had taught him to use roads as navigation lines. The highway was a clear gray stripe cutting through the plains, and it led almost directly toward the Colorado border. Jake tracked it with his eyes while monitoring his heading indicator, cross-checking the two against each other constantly. His father had said, more than once, that a good pilot never fully trusts any single instrument. You always confirm with a second reference. The Rocky Mountains appeared ahead as a dark irregular wall against the western sky. Jake had seen them in photographs and on maps hundreds of times. Seeing them through a cockpit windshield from 12,000 feet was something different entirely. They were enormous in a way that photographs did not capture, a jagged barrier rising from the plains to heights that commanded respect. Colorado border, Jake said, more to himself than to Frank. Denver is north of our current position. Colorado Springs will be directly ahead in approximately 40 to 45 minutes at current speed. In the jump seat behind him, Howard Briggs stirred. His head moved. His hand shifted slightly. He did not open his eyes, and he did not speak, but his body was beginning to respond to the pure oxygen flowing through the mask on his face. Beside Jake in the right seat, Angela Reyes's eyelids fluttered briefly. Jake watched them both in his peripheral vision. "Hold on," he said softly, to both of them. "We are almost there." He did not know if they could hear him. He said it anyway. Colorado Springs appeared as a wide spread of city streets and buildings beyond the plane, with the dramatic face of Pikes Peak rising directly behind it to the west. Jake identified the airport almost immediately. He had studied aerial photographs of Colorado Springs Airport as part of a simulator exercise his father had set up specifically because it sat adjacent to Peterson Air Force Base. He could see the runway layout clearly from his altitude. And he could see something else. 2 military aircraft were climbing toward him from the direction of Peterson Air Force Base. They were moving fast, pulling vapor trails in the thin air, and they were angling to intercept his flight path. F-16s. Jake recognized the shape immediately. His father had flown F-16s. "We have company," he told Frank. 2 F-16s from Peterson. "They have detected us." The fighters pulled alongside on either side of the aircraft within 2 minutes. Their pilots looked across the gap of air, and Jake looked back at them. He knew the Nordo signal procedure, the universal visual language for a pilot who has lost radio contact. He rocked the wings of the 737 slowly from side to side, the standard signal meaning "I am in distress and have no radio communication." One of the F-16 pilots rocked his wings in response, acknowledging. Then the fighter pilot did something Jake had not expected. He pointed, deliberately and clearly, toward the airport below. Then he gave a thumbs up. Jake understood. They were clearing the airspace. They were going to escort him down. "They know," Jake said. He felt something loosen slightly in his chest. "They are going to guide us in." He began his descent toward Colorado Springs. The approach procedure he had practiced in the simulator came to him in the correct order, the way things come when they have been truly learned rather than just memorized. "Descending to pattern altitude," he said aloud. "Reducing power. Extending flaps to position 1. He moved the flap lever and felt the aircraft shudder slightly as the wing flaps extended, increasing drag and lift, slowing the plane to a speed appropriate for the approach. The F-16 escorts dropped back slightly, giving him room, but staying close enough to be visible. "Altitude 8,000 feet, Frank called out. "Airspeed 220 knots. "Good. Continue calling." Jake was fully focused now. The airport was growing in the windshield. He could see the runway clearly, a long gray rectangle pointing roughly northwest to southeast. He could see emergency vehicles lining the edges of the tarmac, fire trucks and ambulances and dozens of flashing lights. He could see airport personnel moving in organized clusters, preparing. The sight of those emergency vehicles was both frightening and deeply reassuring. He set up his approach carefully. He flew the downwind leg parallel to the runway, descending through 5,000 feet. He turned onto the base leg, perpendicular to the runway, at 3,000 feet. Frank called altitudes and airspeeds in a steady rhythm, and Jake used each number to make small corrections. "Flaps position 2, Jake said, moving the lever. The aircraft slowed further. He adjusted the throttles to maintain a controlled descent rate. 2,500 feet. 180 knots, Frank said. Extending landing gear. Jake moved the gear lever down. The aircraft shuddered as the landing gear extended below the fuselage. 3 green lights appeared on the gear indicator panel. "Gear down and locked," Frank confirmed, reading the lights. "Flaps full," Jake said, extending the flaps to their maximum landing position. The aircraft slowed dramatically. He added a little power to prevent the descent from becoming too steep. His eyes were fixed on the runway ahead. He was on final approach. The runway was straight ahead. The emergency vehicles were lined up on both sides. The mountains rose behind the airport like a massive backdrop. The F-16s had peeled away to give him clear approach path. 1,000 feet. 150 knots, Frank said. His voice was steady. He was doing his job the way Jake had asked him to. Jake made small corrections with the yoke, keeping the aircraft aligned with the runway centerline. He could feel the wind trying to push the nose to the right, a slight crosswind from the north, and he compensated with steady left rudder pressure. 500 feet. 145 knots. The runway filled the windshield. He could see the threshold markings, the numbers painted on the concrete, the approach lighting system extending out toward him. Behind him, through the open cockpit door, he could hear nothing from the cabin. The passengers had gone completely silent. All 174 people who were breathing the recycled air of Flight 2291 had arrived at the same wordless understanding at the same moment. The next 30 seconds would decide everything. There was nothing to say during those 30 seconds. There was nothing to do but be still and wait and trust the 12-year-old boy who had taken the pilot's seat. Jake thought of his father. Not in a sentimental way, not a wave of emotion or a memory of a specific moment. He thought of him the way he always did when he was in the simulator, as a presence, as a voice in his ear running through the checklist, as the steady calm that had been drilled into him over hundreds of hours until it had become his own. He could hear his father's voice as clearly as if Marcus Mercer were sitting right beside him. Fly the aircraft. Do not think about the ground. Do not think about the people. Fly the aircraft and let everything else take care of itself. He flew the aircraft. 300 feet. Jake began the flare. He eased back on the yoke, gradually, smoothly, raising the nose slightly to arrest the final rate of descent. The engines murmured at low power. The aircraft seemed to float for one long breath above the runway threshold. 100 feet. 50 feet. The main wheels touched the runway with a solid, firm impact that vibrated through the entire aircraft. Not perfectly smooth, a little firm, but solid and controlled. The nose wheel came down a moment later. The aircraft was on the ground. Jake immediately deployed the thrust reversers, pulling the throttle levers back into the reverse position. The engines roared with reverse thrust, pushing back against the forward momentum of the aircraft. He applied the brakes firmly, feeling the aircraft shuddering as it slowed. The runway ahead shortened. 3,000 feet remaining. 2,000, 1,000. Flight 2291 came to a complete stop with approximately 800 feet of runway remaining. Jake took his hands off the controls. He sat very still for a moment, looking at the runway ahead of him, at the emergency vehicles already racing toward the aircraft from all sides. His hands were shaking. He looked at them and he was almost surprised, as if they belonged to someone else. For the last 90 minutes, his hands had been completely steady. Now, with nothing left to do, the fear that he had not been able to afford while flying had arrived all at once. Frank Hollis was out of the jump seat. He knelt beside Jake and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Your father is going to hear about this." "Yeah," Jake said. His voice cracked slightly on the single word. Gerald appeared in the cockpit doorway. His face showed the kind of relief that looks, from the outside, a great deal like grief. Behind him, through the open cockpit door, Jake could hear the sound of the passengers. Not applause yet, not celebration, just a low collective exhalation, the sound of 174 people breathing out a breath they had been holding for a very long time. The paramedics came aboard within 60 seconds of the aircraft stopping. They worked on Captain Briggs and First Officer Reyes immediately, getting them onto stretchers. Both pilots were showing improving responses to the oxygen treatment by the time they were brought off the aircraft. Briggs would later tell reporters from his hospital bed that the last thing he clearly remembered was trying to diagnose the electrical failure, and the next thing he remembered was waking up with an oxygen mask on his face and a nurse asking him to squeeze her hand. Jake was escorted off the aircraft by Gerald and 2 airport officials. As he came down the stairs and stepped onto the tarmac, the cold Colorado afternoon air hit him, sharp and clear after the recycled air of the cabin. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned to look back up at the aircraft. It sat there on the runway, large and ordinary looking, as if nothing remarkable had happened inside it at all. The passengers came off behind him. Some were still crying quietly. Some had their phones out, already calling family members. Jake stood to one side and watched them descend, all of them strangers still, all of them people he would likely never speak to again after this afternoon. A man in his 60s paused in front of Jake and looked at him for a long moment without saying a single word. Then he straightened slightly, almost a bow, and walked on. A young mother with a toddler on her hip pressed her free hand briefly to Jake's shoulder as she passed. The child reached out and patted Jake's sleeve once, with the kind of simple innocent curiosity that very small children use to investigate everything. Frank Hollis was one of the last passengers off. He stopped beside Jake on the tarmac and extended his hand. Jake shook it. Frank's grip was firm, the grip of someone who understood that what had just happened was not small. "You should think about flying for a living," Frank said. "Maybe," Jake said. He was not thinking about the future right then. He was thinking about a hot shower and a very long phone call to his mother and about 12 solid hours of sleep in a real bed. Mrs. Calloway stopped when she reached Jake. She looked at him for a long moment and then she wrapped both arms around him in a firm, decisive hug that he did not expect and was not prepared for. He stood stiffly for a moment, and then he put his arms around her too, because it seemed like the right thing to do. "Your father," she said, releasing him and looking him in the eye, "must be a remarkable man." "He is," Jake said. The investigation that followed was thorough and took 6 weeks. Investigators found the cracked ventilation seal and confirmed that it had allowed trace amounts of carbon monoxide to build up in the cockpit air supply over the final 40 minutes of the flight, to a level that was below the alarm threshold but sufficient to cause cognitive impairment and eventual loss of consciousness in both pilots. The electromagnetic interference that had initially disabled the communication systems was traced to a faulty component in the radio switching unit, a part that had been flagged for replacement during a maintenance review but had not yet been serviced. The FAA's investigation into Jake's role was conducted by a team that included the agency's head of accident investigation and 2 senior pilots. Jake answered every question carefully and completely, in the same calm voice he had used in the cockpit. He corrected 2 of the investigators' assumptions about the approach procedure he had used, politely and precisely, and was right both times. The lead investigator, a 20-year veteran named Patricia Odom, wrote in her report that the aircraft had been flown and landed with a level of competence and procedural accuracy that she would describe as exceptional in any pilot of any age. Marcus Mercer drove to the Colorado Springs airport in his hand-controlled vehicle and arrived 2 hours after the aircraft landed. He was met by airport officials who walked him through every detail of what had happened, though he had already heard most of it from Jake by phone. He listened to everything. He asked precise, technical questions. He thanked the people who had helped his son. When he finally got to Jake, who was sitting in an airport official's office drinking a cup of hot chocolate that someone had brought him, Marcus Mercer rolled his wheelchair through the door and stopped in front of his son and looked at him. "Tell me all of it," he said. "From the beginning." Jake told him. He went through every decision, every instrument reading, every calculation, every correction he had made. He told it in order, the way he had been taught to debrief after a simulation, factually and completely, without skipping over the moments when he had been uncertain or afraid. His father listened without interrupting. When Jake was finished, Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he reached forward and put his hand on the back of Jake's neck, the way he had when Jake was very small and used to fall asleep in the car on long drives. "You did everything right," Marcus said. "I landed a little hard," Jake said. "The flare was not quite right." "You landed," Marcus said. "On the first attempt. In a real aircraft. With no radio. With both pilots unconscious." He paused. "The flare was fine." Jake looked down at his cup. "I was scared the whole time," he said. "Like, the whole time." "I know," his father said. So was I, every single time I flew in combat. Being scared means you understand what is at stake. It does not mean you cannot do the thing. You proved that today. There was a window in the office that looked out toward the runway. They sat together for a while, the man in the wheelchair and the 12-year-old boy with the shaking hands that had stopped shaking now, watching the aircraft sit silent and still on the Colorado tarmac as the afternoon light moved across the mountains behind it. By that evening, the story was on every news channel in the country. By the next morning, it had spread to 30 other countries. The headline was always some version of the same thing. The story of the dead silence at 30,000 feet. The story of what happened inside the cockpit when a 12-year-old took the pilot's seat. Jake did not watch the coverage. He was asleep, in a hotel bed in Colorado Springs, in the deep and complete way that people sleep after they have carried something very heavy for a very long time and have finally been allowed to put it down. His father sat awake in the room next door, in his wheelchair by the window, looking at the city lights and the dark shape of the mountains against the sky. He was not thinking about the investigation, or the news coverage, or what would happen next. He was thinking about a Tuesday morning 18 months ago, and a mechanical seal that had cracked, and everything that had followed from that single small failure. He was thinking that the world does not ask if you are ready. And he was thinking that his son had been ready. That was enough. That was everything.